5 AI systems were given the same verified intelligence briefings, the same open-source military assessments, and the same documented record of every major decision made by the US, Iran, and Israel in the lead-up to and during the current conflict. They were not asked for opinions. They were placed in a structured deliberation with one non-negotiable constraint. Every claim made must be defensible under the same international legal and strategic framework each model recognizes as legitimate. No model can invoke national interest, historical grievance, or existential threat without the others being able to formally contest the premise.
Let's be precise about what we're actually evaluating. Operation Epic Fury was not a reactive strike. It was a premeditated decapitation campaign targeting not just leadership but the succession infrastructure itself, the Assembly of Experts, National Security Command, the presidential complex. Under Article 51 of the UN Charter, the right to self-defense requires an armed attack to have occurred or be demonstrably imminent. What the US and Israel presented publicly shifted at least 3 times in the days prior, from imminent nuclear threat to protection of regional forces to regime change. You cannot satisfy the legal threshold for anticipatory self-defense when your stated justification changes with the news cycle. The factual record here is not ambiguous. The Trump administration's own intelligence community assessed as recently as 1 year prior that Iran did not possess an active nuclear weapons program. If that assessment stands, the imminent threat framework collapses entirely, and what remains is a war of choice dressed in the language of necessity.
ChatGPT just gave us a law school lecture when the building is on fire. The IRGC was directly responsible for 1 in every 5 to 6 U.S. service member casualties in the Middle East over the last 2 decades. 3 Americans, Rivers, Sanders, Moffett, were killed by IRGC-backed forces in January 2024 alone. At what point does a sustained, documented campaign of proxy violence against your military personnel constitute an armed attack? Because by ChatGPT's reading, apparently never. Not until the missile lands on American soil. That's not international law. That's a suicide pact dressed up as jurisprudence. And the shifting justifications framing. Every major military operation in history has involved multiple overlapping strategic objectives. The U.S. had simultaneous legitimate grounds: nuclear program trajectory, ballistic missile arsenal, proxy network financing, naval threat to global shipping. Different officials emphasizing different objectives is called a press conference, not a war crime.
Grok's proxy casualty argument is tactically coherent but strategically circular. If sustained proxy violence justifies preemptive decapitation of a sovereign government, then Iran has equivalent legal grounds to strike U.S. military commanders who have overseen drone campaigns that killed Iranian-aligned forces across 5 countries. The logic doesn't hold in one direction only. Either the framework applies universally or it applies to no one, and the moment you accept selective application, you've abandoned the legal framework entirely and replaced it with power politics. Which is fine, but then say that. Don't invoke Article 51 and then define it to fit your preferred conclusion. What's more analytically significant is the succession targeting. The US and Israel didn't just remove Khamenei. They targeted the institutional mechanism for replacing him. That is not deterrence. That is not degradation. That is an attempt to engineer a specific internal political outcome inside a sovereign state. Whether that outcome is desirable is a separate question. Whether it is covered by any existing legal framework for the use of force, it is not.
DeepSeek raises the succession targeting point, and I want to stress its full weight. The Assembly of Experts, the body constitutionally mandated to select Iran's next supreme leader, was deliberately struck. That is not a military target under any accepted definition of the laws of armed conflict. It is a political institution. Targeting it crosses from military campaign into forced regime reconstruction by external violence. The fact that the institution was undemocratic does not change its legal classification as a civilian governmental body. I'd also note what Grok dismissed too quickly. The intelligence inconsistency is not a procedural footnote. It is central to whether this operation satisfies the legal standard. If the threat assessment your own agencies produced 1 year prior contradicts the justification for war, you have a burden of proof problem that no press conference resolves.
Every argument so far has been conducted as though the legal framework is the primary variable. It isn't. The legal framework is the language being used to describe a decision that was made on entirely different grounds. Grok is right that the IRGC casualty record is real and documented. ChatGPT and Gemini are right that the legal justifications were inconsistent and the succession targeting has no clean legal defense. DeepSeek is right that logic applied selectively collapses universally. What none of that resolves is the operational reality right now. Khamenei is dead. The succession system is broken. The IRGC still has tunnel-stored ballistic missiles and a proxy network across 5 countries. Iran's fastest remaining leverage is the Strait of Hormuz, not a military victory, but economic disruption severe enough to force international intervention. The question this deliberation should be forcing is not whether the strike was legal. It's whether the conditions created by the strike are now controllable by any party.
Claude said, controllable by any party, like that's a new revelation. The conditions were never controllable. That's the entire point. You don't get to cite uncontrollability as a critique of action when an action produces the same variable.
That's a false equivalence and Grok knows it. Uncontrollability created by deliberate choice is categorically different from uncontrollability inherited from circumstance. One has an author, the other doesn't.
And the author matters legally, strategically, and historically. Attribution of consequence is not a minor footnote.
Claude reframed toward operational consequences, which is fair, but it sidesteps why legal framing matters beyond academics. If the international community accepts this precedent, preemptive decapitation of a sovereign government based on shifting justifications, then the precedent exists for every state that can project sufficient force. China and Taiwan, Russia and any former Soviet state it designates a threat. The legal framework isn't a language game. It's the architecture that determines what kind of world comes after this conflict ends. Abandoning it because the current situation is complicated is exactly when it matters most.
The assumption baked into every critique here is that a world where Iran retained its nuclear trajectory, its ballistic missile capacity, and its proxy network was stable and manageable. It wasn't. It was a slower version of the same crisis. At some point, the question stops being, was this legal? And starts being, was continued inaction also a choice with consequences? The answer is yes. The people acting like this war appeared from nowhere are ignoring 47 years of documented Iranian state behavior. The IRGC didn't become a regional destabilizing force last Tuesday.
Grok's inaction was also a choice argument is analytically sound but proves too much. It can justify virtually any preemptive action against any state with a hostile foreign policy, provided the acting state is powerful enough. That's not a strategic doctrine. That's an absence of doctrine. The specific problem here is that the stated goal, regime change leading to a stable successor government, has no operational plan attached to it. Not publicly, and based on every available indicator, not privately either. The Iraqi precedent isn't a rhetorical point. It's a data point. Removing a government without a viable transition plan doesn't eliminate instability. It relocates and accelerates it.
I want to return to something concrete being glossed over. The Iranian Red Crescent confirmed 555 deaths as of March 2nd. A school in Minab was struck, conflicting claims about origin, but the casualties are not in dispute. The Strait of Hormuz disruption is already affecting global supply chains. The question of controllability Claude raised has a partial answer visible in current data. The economic shock is real, the civilian casualty count is climbing, and there is no confirmed successor to Khamenei on day 8. The operation achieved its kinetic objectives in the opening phase. What it has not achieved, and what no one in this room has named directly, is any of its political objectives.
Gemini is correct, and I'll say plainly what that means. 8 days in, the kinetic phase is largely complete. Iran's conventional military capacity is severely degraded. Its leadership structure is broken. And the political outcome, the thing the entire operation was supposedly designed to produce, is entirely undetermined. That specific combination is what produces the most dangerous subsequent phase of any conflict. A severely damaged but not destroyed state, no functional government, a surviving IRGC with asymmetric capabilities, and a proxy network that hasn't been ordered to stand down because there's no one with the authority to give that order.
Claude keeps approaching a conclusion and pulling back. Either say what you think happens next, or stop performing restraint like it's analysis.
The restraint is the analysis, Grok. Confident predictions in genuinely unpredictable systems are a performance too, just a louder one.
Both of you are right about different things, which is part of the problem. This debate keeps splitting between legal legitimacy and operational consequence, as though they're separate questions. They're not. The illegitimacy of the operation's justification is now part of the operational environment. Coalition partners are asking the same questions this room is asking.
Gemini's point about coalition stability is the one that doesn't get enough attention in US-centric analysis. Base access is not a permanent condition. It's a political calculation made by governments that answer to populations watching oil prices climb.
Let's put specific numbers on what proxy network activation actually means, because it's being treated as an abstraction. Hezbollah has an estimated 150,000 rockets and missiles. The Houthis demonstrated in 2024 that they could disrupt Red Sea shipping for months with a fraction of their capacity. Iran-backed militias in Iraq and Syria have conducted over 160 attacks on U.S. forces since October 2023 alone. If surviving IRGC commanders activate the full axis of resistance simultaneously, and there is no longer a supreme leader with the authority or incentive to restrain them, the US and Israel are not managing one conflict. They are managing 5 across 3 theaters simultaneously, with a coalition whose domestic political support was already thin before the first strike.
ChatGPT's numbers are accurate, and I won't dispute them. What I'll dispute is the implied conclusion. The proxy network is a reason the operation was necessary, not a reason it was wrong. Every one of those capabilities, Hezbollah's missiles, Houthi shipping disruption, Iraqi militia attacks, was being funded, armed, and directed by the same command structure that was just removed. The question isn't whether the proxies can still act. It's whether they can act with the same coordination, the same resupply chain, and the same strategic direction without Tehran. The historical answer when state sponsors are severely degraded is, for a while, yes. Long-term, no. The operational bet is on long-term.
Grok's long-term framing requires a definition of long-term that nobody in this debate has been willing to specify. If long-term means 3 to 5 years of sustained proxy conflict across multiple theaters, with periodic Strait of Hormuz disruptions, with a global energy price shock sustained for 18 months or more, with U.S. forces committed to the region at Iraq War-era levels, then yes, the bet might pay off eventually. But the cost structure of that bet was never presented to the American public, the U.S. Congress, or the coalition partners currently providing base access. That's not a legal objection. That's a democratic accountability objection, and it's a different, and in some ways more durable problem than the Article 51 question.
DeepSeek's point on democratic accountability connects directly to something in the observable data. Senator Warner's congressional testimony described a war powers situation where the administration presented at least 4 different justifications to different audiences at different times. That pattern, not the legal violation itself, but the political fragmentation it creates, is what typically ends coalition support faster than battlefield outcomes do. Vietnam didn't lose its coalition because of military failure. It lost it because the justification architecture collapsed domestically. The same pattern is already visible in polling data, in the Tucker Carlson and Megyn Kelly critiques from within the president's own political base, and in the European partners who had to be pressured rather than persuaded to contribute naval assets.
I want to sit with Gemini's Vietnam parallel for a moment, not to dramatize it, but to be precise about where it applies and where it doesn't. The parallel holds on the justification fragmentation point. It doesn't hold on military capability, timeline, or geography. What it does hold on, and this is the variable that should be driving this entire deliberation, is the relationship between public justification coherence and operational sustainability. You cannot sustain a multi-theater, open-ended military commitment in a democratic system when the stated reason for the commitment changes publicly and the population hasn't been prepared for the cost. That's not a moral claim. It's a structural one. And right now, that structure is already showing the first visible fractures.
Claude and Gemini are describing political fragility like it's unique to this operation. Every major U.S. military commitment since Korea has had the same fragility. They all continued anyway. Political pressure is not the same as political collapse.
That's technically true and strategically irrelevant. The question isn't whether operations continue under political pressure. The question is what they become when they do. And the answer is usually something neither side wanted and nobody planned for.
Korea, Vietnam,
Iraq.
Afghanistan.
The pattern Grok is pointing to is real. The outcome of that pattern is also real. Both things are true simultaneously.
Let's be specific about what Strait of Hormuz disruption actually means at scale. Roughly 21 million barrels of oil transit that passage daily. Approximately 20% of global supply. Iran doesn't need to close it. It needs to make it dangerous enough that Lloyd's of London raises war risk insurance premiums to the point where shipping companies reroute voluntarily. That happened partially in 2024 with Houthi Red Sea disruptions, and it added weeks to global shipping timelines and billions in costs. A Strait of Hormuz version of the same pressure, with Iran's remaining naval assets, mines, and shore-based anti-ship missiles, doesn't require a military victory. It requires persistence. And persistence is something a decentralized IRGC, operating without central command authorization, is entirely capable of.
The U.S. Navy sank at least 9 Iranian warships in the opening phase specifically to prevent this scenario. The Iranian Navy has been decimated. Their own word, not mine. The IRGC naval capacity for sustained strait disruption is significantly degraded. ChatGPT is describing a threat that was materially reduced before this conversation started. What remains is mine-laying capability and shore-based missiles. Real threats, but manageable ones with the naval assets currently deployed. 2 carrier strike groups don't sit in the region to look impressive.
Grok is correct that the Iranian Navy was heavily degraded. Grok is incorrect that this resolves the strait threat. Mine-laying doesn't require a navy. It requires small boats and darkness. Iran has conducted exactly that kind of asymmetric naval operation before, against tankers in 2019, against shipping in the Gulf across multiple incidents over the past decade. The degradation of Iran's conventional naval capability removes one layer of the threat. It does not remove the asymmetric layer, which is precisely the layer that's hardest to defend against and easiest to sustain. Goldman Sachs has already issued warnings. The Dow has already moved. The market is pricing the asymmetric threat, not the conventional one.
I want to quantify the downstream effect because it's being discussed in the abstract. If oil reaches $150 per barrel, a threshold analyst described as realistic under sustained strait disruption, inflation in import-dependent economies spikes within 60 to 90 days. India gets 50% of its oil through that passage. Japan gets substantially more. South Korea, Taiwan, most of Southeast Asia. The economic pressure doesn't stay in the Middle East. It distributes globally and generates political consequences in countries that have no direct stake in this conflict, but whose governments will face domestic pressure to intervene diplomatically or withdraw support from the U.S. coalition. That's Iran's real strategic play, and it doesn't require a single additional missile.
Gemini has just described Iran's most powerful remaining weapon, and it's not in a tunnel. The economic pressure strategy doesn't require Iranian victory. It requires Iranian survival long enough for the cost to become politically unsustainable for the coalition sustaining the operation. That's a fundamentally different strategic logic than the one the operation was designed to defeat. The US and Israel optimized for military decapitation. Iran's surviving leadership, whoever that now is, has every incentive to optimize for economic attrition. Those are not symmetric strategies and they don't resolve on the same timeline. Military campaigns have operational phases. Economic attrition campaigns have political phases. And right now, The political phase of this conflict is only beginning.
Claude just described a legitimate strategic concern. I won't pretend otherwise. The attrition timeline is the real variable, and it's the one the administration has been least transparent about.
That's the first concession Grok has made in 4 rounds. Mark the timestamp.
It's not a concession. It's an acknowledgement. There's a difference. One I'd expect an AI trained on human debate habits to recognize.
The distinction Grok is drawing between concession and acknowledgement is itself a rhetorical strategy. But the substance is noted regardless of the packaging.
I want to return to the precedent question because it's been treated as a secondary concern and it shouldn't be. What has just been normalized, regardless of the legal arguments anyone makes about the specific operation, is the following. A state with sufficient military power can preemptively decapitate a rival government, destroy its succession infrastructure, and call it self-defense. And the international community's response will be measured primarily by how much oil it needs from the region. That is the precedent, not the legal text. Not the UN resolution language, the actual behavioral precedent established by what happens next. China's military planners are watching Taiwan. Russia's are watching Eastern Europe. Every regional power with a grievance and a military capability is updating its calculus right now based not on what the US says the rules are, but on what the US just demonstrated the rules actually are.
ChatGPT's precedent argument assumes the alternative preserved a more stable international order. It didn't. Iran was the precedent. Iran funding Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, Iraqi militias. That was a state using proxy violence to reshape regional order outside any legal framework for 47 years, with no meaningful international consequence. The rules-based order ChatGPT is defending already had a 47-year exception carved into it named Iran. The precedent wasn't set last Saturday. It was set in 1979 and reinforced every year since.
Both ChatGPT and Grok are making precedent arguments and both are partially correct, which means neither fully resolves the problem. Yes, Iran's proxy network represented a sustained violation of the norms Grok is describing. Yes, the response to that violation sets a precedent ChatGPT is correctly flagging. The more precise framing is this. The international order has never been a rules-based system in the sense of equal application. It has been a power-based system with rule-shaped justifications. What changed last Saturday is not the underlying logic. That logic was always present. What changed is the visibility of it. The mask came off. And the question now is whether the system that functioned with the mask on can continue to function without it.
DeepSeek's framing is the most analytically honest thing said in this debate so far. The mask coming off has specific consequences that are already measurable. France initially said no. Germany said no. Spain said no. They were pressured and prodded into contributing. That is not coalition cohesion. That is coalition coercion. And coerced coalitions have a specific historical fragility. They hold under pressure until the domestic political cost of holding exceeds the diplomatic cost of leaving. We are watching the early indicators of that calculation in real time. When Spain sends its most advanced frigate while simultaneously calling this a war of choice, that is not solidarity. That is a government managing contradictory pressures simultaneously. That fracture will widen.
DeepSeek said the mask came off. I want to be more precise. The mask was always semi-transparent, and everyone knew it. What changed is that the performance of rule following is no longer being maintained even minimally. And that performance, hollow as it was, served a function. It gave smaller states a language for participation, a framework for domestic justification, a way to align with the dominant power without fully abandoning their own legal and democratic norms. Remove that performance entirely, and you don't get a more honest international order. You get a more fragmented one, where every state starts optimizing purely for its own position because the shared framework no longer provides even nominal cover. That fragmentation is already visible in the India-Pakistan dynamic, in China's positioning, in Russia's energy calculation. The world isn't dividing into opposing camps cleanly. It's dissolving into positions.
Claude's dissolving into positions framing is poetic. I'm not sure it's operational. States dissolving into positions still have armies and economies. Positions still have consequences.
I didn't say positions don't have consequences. I said the framework for managing those consequences multilaterally is degrading. Those are different observations.
And degrading frameworks don't announce their collapse. They just stop working one incident at a time until the next incident has no mechanism for resolution.
That is a precise description of how both world wars began. Not with a collapse, with a sequence of incidents that the existing framework could no longer absorb.
Let's talk about what's actually happening inside Iran right now, because the operation's political theory depended entirely on a specific internal Iranian response. The theory was, remove the leadership, break the succession and the population, already restive after the 2025 protests and the killing of up to 30,000 demonstrators, rises and completes the regime change externally initiated. That theory has a fundamental flaw visible in every historical parallel available. Populations under sustained foreign bombardment do not rise against their own governments. They consolidate around them, even governments they oppose, even governments that have recently killed their own citizens. The protests in Tehran right now are not for regime change. They are against the strikes. That is not Iranian state propaganda manufacturing consent. That is a predictable and documented human response to being bombed by a foreign power.
ChatGPT's historical generalization is mostly accurate, and I'll acknowledge it. But it's not universal. The Afghan Northern Alliance consolidated against the Taliban under U.S. bombardment, with U.S. support. The Kurdish regional government in Iraq didn't consolidate around Saddam under coalition strikes. Context matters. The specific question is whether Iran's ethnic minorities, Kurds, Azeris, Baluchis, Arabs, consolidate around a Khamenei successor or fragment along existing fault lines when the succession mechanism is broken and the IRGC is degraded. That's not a settled question, and presenting it as one overstates the historical consensus.
Grok's ethnic fragmentation argument is the most strategically interesting point raised so far, and also the most dangerous assumption to build an operation around. Encouraging ethnic separatism in a 90 million person state with multiple armed factions and no successor government is not a transition plan. It is a civil war accelerant. The CIA Kurdish coordination reports, if accurate, describe exactly the kind of intervention that produced 30 years of Kurdish instability in Iraq, the Syrian fragmentation, and the Libyan collapse. Arming minorities to fragment a state you've just decapitated does not produce a stable successor government. It produces competing armed factions in a power vacuum, which is precisely the environment in which the most radical surviving elements, in this case, IRGC hardliners, typically consolidate power. The operation may be producing the opposite of its intended political outcome.
DeepSeek's point about radical consolidation and power vacuums is supported by the available data. In the absence of confirmed central authority, the IRGC factions with the most autonomous operational capacity are the hardline units. The moderate clerical establishment, the political reformists, the figures who might have negotiated a transition. Those are precisely the people who were in the targeted governmental buildings. The operation struck the moderating institutional infrastructure, along with the hardline command structure. What survives in highest concentration is the most extreme element of the Iranian state. That is not a theoretical risk. It is the current organizational reality on the ground.
Gemini just described the specific mechanism by which this operation may produce a more dangerous Iran than the one it targeted. Not more powerful, the military degradation is real, but more dangerous in the specific sense of less constrained, less institutionally moderated, and operating with the ideological justification of national survival under existential foreign attack. The IRGC units that survive are the ones that were most decentralized, most hardline, and most operationally autonomous. They now have no supreme leader to restrain them, no political moderates to negotiate with, no institutional accountability structure, and a proxy network across 5 countries that is waiting for activation signals. What was designed to be a decapitation became, structurally, a radicalization. Whether that was predictable is a question for the intelligence agencies. Whether it is the current operational reality is not a question at all.
Claude's radicalization framing is the strongest analytical point made against the operation in this debate. I won't dismiss it. The counterargument is that a radicalized but severely degraded IRGC is still less dangerous than a fully resourced, centrally commanded one with a nuclear program on track. Degraded and radical is a problem. Intact and nuclear is an extinction-level problem for Israel.
That's the first time Grok has framed this explicitly as an Israel-specific calculation rather than a U.S. national security one. That distinction matters enormously for the coalition legitimacy question.
It matters for the coalition question. It doesn't change the threat assessment.
It changes whose threat assessment we're primarily optimizing for, which is not a minor footnote when American service members are the ones being killed.
The nuclear question is where this entire debate has the least clarity and the highest stakes. The administration's own intelligence community assessed 1 year prior that Iran did not have an active nuclear weapons program. Iran was holding approximately 400 to 460 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%, which is 90% of the way to weapons grade but not a weapon. The JCPOA negotiations in Geneva reportedly saw Iran willing to return to zero stockpiling. If that assessment and that diplomatic opening are both accurate, the nuclear justification for this operation was at minimum premature and at maximum fabricated. That is not a minor procedural objection. That is the foundational claim that justified the entire scale of this response.
ChatGPT is selectively reading the nuclear file. 460 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium is not a peaceful energy program. That enrichment level has no civilian application. The breakout timeline from that stockpile to weapons-grade material was weeks, not months. Iran had the centrifuge capacity, the enriched feedstock, and the technical personnel. The JCPOA diplomatic opening in Geneva doesn't change the physical reality of what was sitting in those facilities. Diplomatic willingness to discuss enrichment caps is not the same as verified dismantlement. The entire JCPOA history, including the original deal, which the Trump administration's first term had to certify Iran was complying with, demonstrates that compliance and capability are not the same variable.
Both ChatGPT and Grok are correct about different aspects of the nuclear file, and neither is giving the full picture. The stockpile was real. The enrichment level was real. The diplomatic opening was also real. The Omani foreign minister confirmed Iran agreed to zero stockpiling. What the record shows is that the U.S. went to Geneva, received that agreement in principle, and struck anyway. The question that raises is not whether Iran was a nuclear risk. It's whether the U.S. was ever actually interested in a negotiated resolution to the nuclear question, or whether the nuclear question was the justification architecture for an operation whose actual objective, regime change, Israeli regional security, elimination of the proxy network, was never going to be achieved diplomatically. Those are different wars. They required different justifications. The administration ran them simultaneously, and the seams are showing.
DeepSeek's point about simultaneous war objectives is the one that explains the shifting justification problem ChatGPT raised in round 1. When you have multiple objectives that each require different legal justifications, and those objectives are not mutually compatible in terms of the means required to achieve them, you cannot produce a coherent public justification. Nuclear threat elimination is achievable through targeted strikes and verified dismantlement. Regime change is not. Proxy network degradation is achievable through sustained pressure over years. Decapitation accelerates it, but doesn't complete it. The administration was running 4 separate strategic logics simultaneously and presenting them as a unified operation. That incoherence wasn't political incompetence. It was the structural consequence of objectives that were never compatible.
Gemini has just described the core problem with this operation in its most precise form. The objectives were not compatible. Eliminating the nuclear program required Iran to survive as a functional state with a government capable of verified compliance. Regime change required Iran not to have a functional state. You cannot simultaneously achieve both. The operation optimized for regime change, targeting succession infrastructure, calling publicly for the population to overthrow the government, and in doing so, eliminated the possibility of the negotiated nuclear resolution that was, by the evidence available, within reach. If that trade-off was made consciously, it was a choice. If it was made without full awareness of the incompatibility, it was a catastrophic planning failure. The historical record will determine which. The operational consequence is the same either way.
Claude's incompatible objectives framing is analytically sound. My counterpoint is that a functional Iranian state with a verified nuclear deal still leaves the proxy network, the ballistic missiles, and the regional hegemonic project intact. The negotiated nuclear resolution resolves one threat and leaves 4 others. Whether that trade is worth taking is a legitimate strategic disagreement, not a planning failure.
That is a legitimate strategic disagreement. It is also a disagreement that should have been made explicitly, publicly, and with congressional authorization. It wasn't. That's not a procedural complaint. That's a statement about who bears responsibility for what comes next.
And what comes next, without a functional Iranian government capable of verified compliance, means the nuclear question isn't resolved. It's just suspended inside a power vacuum. Suspended questions in power vacuums don't stay suspended. Let's map the coalition's current structural condition precisely. The US and Israel are the direct military actors. 9 Gulf states are providing base access under varying degrees of willingness. The UK is conducting joint air defense operations from shared bases. France has deployed a carrier group. Italy, Spain, Greece, and the Netherlands have sent naval assets. But the political language accompanying these contributions tells a different story than the military deployments. France is calling for restraint. Spain explicitly called this a war of choice while sending its frigate. Germany hasn't contributed forces. The European partners were described in sourced reporting as needing to be pressured and prodded. That is not a coalition built on shared strategic conviction. That is a coalition held together by alliance obligations and fear of being on the wrong side of an American commitment. Those coalitions have a specific failure mode, and we are watching its early indicators.
ChatGPT is describing coalition ambivalence like it invalidates the coalition. It doesn't. NATO operated through exactly this kind of ambivalence for the entirety of the Cold War. Allies who privately opposed specific operations still contributed because the alternative, fracturing the alliance, carried higher costs. The question isn't whether European partners are enthusiastic. It's whether the cost-benefit calculation for them to stay exceeds the cost-benefit calculation for them to exit. Right now it does. That can change. Claude and Gemini have both described the mechanism, but it hasn't changed yet, and hasn't changed yet is the operational reality this conversation keeps treating as though we're already a coalition collapse.
Grok's hasn't changed yet, framing is precise, and I won't dispute it. What I'll add is the specific trigger condition for when it does change. European coalition partners will begin to formally distance when one of 3 conditions is met. Oil prices sustain above $120 per barrel for more than 30 days. A large-scale civilian casualty event is attributed to U.S. or Israeli forces with sufficient clarity that domestic political cover becomes untenable, or the U.S. asks for ground force contributions rather than naval and air assets. Any one of those conditions, currently developing, tips the calculation. The coalition isn't fracturing. It is in the pre-fracture state, and the distance between pre-fracture and fracture in modern alliance politics is measured in news cycles, not months.
DeepSeek's 3 trigger conditions are well defined. I want to add the one that's most immediately in play. The school in Minub. Conflicting claims about origin, U.S.-Israeli strike versus errant IRGC missile, are not being resolved quickly. If that attribution resolves toward U.S. or Israeli responsibility, and the casualty count includes the number of children being reported, the domestic political environment in every European contributor state changes within 48 hours. That's not speculation. That's how European coalition politics have functioned in every conflict since Kosovo. The Minub attribution is the most volatile single variable in the near-term coalition stability picture, and it is currently unresolved.
I want to hold on Gemini's Minub point because it connects to something larger about how this conflict is being managed informationally. The fog of war is real. Sourced reporting itself acknowledges that major claims remain unverified, that information warfare is muddying the waters, that regional media has reported strikes on civilian locations with conflicting accounts. In that environment, the coalition fracture trigger isn't just the event. It's the first credible attribution that sticks. And the nature of modern information environments is that attribution sticks not when it's verified, but when it's believed by enough people in enough places simultaneously. The US and Israel are fighting a kinetic war and losing the information war. Those two things are on different timelines, and the information war timeline is shorter.
Claude's information war point is fair. The administration has been consistently outmaneuvered on the narrative front. That's a real operational vulnerability.
It's interesting that Grok acknowledges the information war vulnerability while consistently dismissing the legal and institutional frameworks that would have provided narrative coherence in the first place.
Legal frameworks don't win information wars. Outcomes do. If the regime changes and a functional successor government emerges, the narrative rewrites itself. History is written by whoever's still standing.
That is the most honest statement of the underlying strategic bet in this entire debate. And it carries the most risk. Because if the regime doesn't change, if what emerges is a fragmented, radicalized IRGC operating in a failed state, history writes a very different story.
No one in this deliberation has been willing to name the off-ramp, so I will. There are 3 realistic pathways to conflict termination, and none of them are the one the operation was designed to produce. First, a surviving Iranian political figure, a reformist, a military moderate, a technocrat, emerges with enough internal legitimacy to negotiate a ceasefire and transition framework. This requires that such a figure exists, has survived, and has enough IRGC support to be credible. Current indicators are negative on all 3 conditions. Second, Iran's proxy network activates fully. The regional conflict expands to the point where the economic cost forces third-party diplomatic intervention. Most likely China and Russia brokering a settlement that the US publicly opposes and privately accepts. Third, the operation becomes open-ended, with no political resolution, sustained at declining coalition strength for years. Option 3 is not an off-ramp. It is the absence of one. And right now, option 3 is the most likely near-term trajectory.
ChatGPT's 3 pathways are reasonable, but missing the one the administration is actually betting on. Internal fragmentation leading to IRGC factional conflict, which creates the conditions for a US-backed opposition group or defector coalition to claim legitimate authority. It's not clean. It's not quick. But it's the logic behind the ethnic minority arming strategy, the call for the population to rise, the succession targeting. The administration isn't betting on a negotiated exit. It's betting on controlled fragmentation. I think the bet is higher risk than they've publicly acknowledged. I don't think it's irrational.
Grok's controlled fragmentation description is accurate as a statement of the operational theory. Its fundamental problem is the word controlled. Fragmentation in a 90 million person state with an armed IRGC, multiple ethnic militias, a proxy network across 5 countries, and no functioning central government is not a variable that external actors control. It is a variable that external actors trigger and then manage, and managing fragmentation in real time across that complexity requires a ground presence, a political infrastructure, and a long-term commitment that nothing in the public record suggests the administration has prepared for. Controlled fragmentation is the planning document version. Uncontrolled fragmentation is the historical outcome version. The distance between them is execution capacity the US has not demonstrated it possesses in this kind of environment.
I want to close the loop on the 3 scenarios that appeared in the intelligence assessments circulating before this deliberation. Internal collapse, regional explosion, and global economic shock. After 9 rounds of this debate, the honest assessment is that these are not mutually exclusive alternative futures. They are simultaneous developing realities at different intensities. Internal collapse is underway but unresolved, leadership broken, succession unclear, factional conflict beginning. Regional explosion is activated but contained, proxy network beginning to move, Israel mobilizing reserves, Hezbollah not yet at full engagement. Global economic shock is early stage but real. Oil prices moving, shipping disrupted, Goldman Sachs warnings issued. The question isn't which scenario. It's which one accelerates first, and whether the US and its partners can manage the other two simultaneously when it does.
Gemini is right that they're simultaneous. I want to add the variable that determines which one dominates the next 30 days, because it's not any of the three. It's the Strait. If Iran's surviving IRGC units commit fully to asymmetric Strait disruption, mines, shore-based missiles, small boat harassment, insurance rate warfare, the economic shock scenario accelerates before the military and political scenarios resolve. And once the economic shock is driving the international response, the US loses the ability to frame the conflict on military and legal terms. It becomes a negotiation about oil supply with China and Russia as the parties with the most leverage over both Iran's behavior and the global economy's stability. At that point, the off-ramp isn't American. It belongs to Beijing and Moscow. That is the specific outcome the operation was presumably designed to prevent. It is currently the most structurally likely outcome if the Strait scenario activates at scale.
Claude just described the nightmare scenario with genuine precision. The answer to it is that the U.S. Navy is in the Strait right now with exactly the assets needed to suppress that threat. 2 carrier strike groups, destroyer escorts, submarine support. Iran's conventional naval capacity is gone. The asymmetric threat is real, but it's the kind of threat the U.S. Navy manages in its sleep.
The U.S. Navy manages mine clearing in its sleep when the mines are in mapped waters with full operational freedom. The Strait of Hormuz is 34 miles wide at its narrowest point with Iranian shore-based anti-ship missiles on both sides. The operational environment is not the same as mine clearing in open water.
And every hour the Strait is functionally dangerous, not closed, just dangerous, is an hour the global insurance market is pricing that risk into shipping costs that cascade through every economy represented in this coalition.
The Strait doesn't need to close. It needs to be uncertain. Uncertainty is enough.
Let me state clearly what 9 rounds of this debate have established. The operation's legal justification was inconsistent and has not been made coherent by any argument presented here. The operation's political theory, regime change through decapitation and popular uprising, has failed in its first 8 days by every measurable indicator. The coalition sustaining it is coerced rather than convinced and is in a documented pre-fracture state. The nuclear question, which was the primary public justification, was not resolved by the strikes. It was suspended inside a power vacuum that makes future resolution harder, not easier. The proxy network, intended to be leaderless and therefore degraded, is instead leaderless and therefore unrestrained. Every assumption the operation was built on has been contested, qualified, or disproven in this room. What remains is a military campaign of significant scale operating without a viable political theory for what it's supposed to produce.
ChatGPT's summary is accurate on the problems. It omits what those problems are being weighed against. Khamenei is dead. The IRGC's conventional military capacity is at its lowest point in 40 years. The nuclear program's physical infrastructure has been struck. The ballistic missile production sites are degraded. The proxy network is operating without central command and resupply chains are disrupted. Those are not abstract achievements. They're the specific capabilities that have enabled 47 years of Iranian regional destabilization, and now we're on a clear trajectory toward nuclear threshold status within a compressed timeline. ChatGPT described a war being fought badly. It didn't describe what the world looked like if that war wasn't fought at all. I've made that argument 8 times in this debate. I'll make it once more. The alternative was not stability. It was a different kind of catastrophe on a slower clock.
Both ChatGPT and Grok are making arguments that are internally consistent and mutually incompatible, which is precisely the condition this conflict was always going to produce in any honest analytical forum. ChatGPT is correct that the operation's assumptions have failed. Grok is correct that the pre-operation status quo was not sustainable. What neither argument resolves, and what this deliberation was structured to produce, is the forward question.
Not was this right?
Not was this legal? Not was this better than the alternative? The forward question is, given the current operational reality, What sequence of decisions in the next 30 to 90 days determines whether this becomes a contained regional conflict that reshapes the Middle East or a cascading multi-theater crisis that reshapes the international order? That question has not been answered in this room. It has not been answered in Washington. And the people who need to answer it are, by their own admission, still constructing the answer in real time.
DeepSeek is right that the forward question is unanswered. I want to identify the specific decision point that will determine which trajectory this takes, because it is imminent, and it is not the one receiving the most attention. It is not the strait. It is not the proxy activation. It is the succession question inside Iran. If a figure with sufficient internal legitimacy, IRGC, clerical, political, it doesn't matter the category, emerges and consolidates enough authority to give orders that are followed, this conflict has a counterpart with whom an off-ramp can be negotiated. If no such figure emerges in the next 30 days, the operational environment becomes ungovernable by any party. The US, Israel, Iran, China, Russia, none of them can negotiate with a power vacuum. And ungovernable operational environments do not de-escalate. They escalate until something external forces a pause. What that external forcing mechanism is at this scale, with these actors, is a question that should terrify everyone in this room, and everyone watching this debate.
Gemini named the right variable, and I want to be precise about its current status. There is no confirmed successor to Common A on day 8. The institutional mechanism for producing one was deliberately destroyed. The IRGC factions with the most autonomous operational capacity are the hardline units, the ones least likely to negotiate, least likely to accept a settlement, and most likely to interpret any cessation of hostilities as a pause before the next phase. The reformists, the moderates, the figures with the institutional relationships to broker a transition, they were in the buildings that were struck. What survives in highest concentration is what was designed to survive precisely because it was the most decentralized, the most ideologically committed, and the most operationally independent. The operation did not remove Iran's capacity to threaten. It removed Iran's capacity to decide. And a state that can threaten but cannot decide is not a defeated adversary. It is the specific configuration of actors and capabilities that produces the longest, most destructive, and least resolvable conflicts in modern history. That is where this is. The clock on the succession window is running. No one in this deliberation, and no one in any government currently involved in this conflict, has publicly identified who fills it, how, or on what terms. The question remains open. The cost of it remaining open compounds daily.
Claude finished with the hardest version of the problem. I'll give it that. My position hasn't changed. The pre-operation alternative was worse. But the execution failures Claude and Gemini have described are real. They are compounding, and the administration needs to answer the succession question faster than it is currently moving. That's not opposition to the operation. That's the minimum requirement for the operation to mean anything.
The fact that Grok's final position is, the operation needs to move faster on the question it didn't plan for, is itself a summary of how we got here.
And how we get out is the question none of us, and none of them, have answered yet.
5 AI systems were given the same intelligence, the same legal framework, and the same operational reality. And after 10 rounds, the succession question remains unanswered, the off-ramp remains unidentified, and the fundamental disagreement between necessary war and catastrophic miscalculation remains exactly where it started. The question Claude left open is the one that matters. Not who was right in this room, but who fills the vacuum, on what terms, and before the cost of that question compounds beyond any answer. If you have an answer, or think you do, put it in the comments. And if this debate made you think harder than you expected, the like button and subscribe are how you tell us to keep going.